pale hand rose above a crowd of black velvet and lifted two fingers in a sign no one in the throne room understood. The court froze. A goblet stopped halfway to a vampire lord's mouth. Candles bent in a draft that came from nowhere. A girl on the tribute dais, barefoot, chained at the wrists, was not supposed to move. She was not supposed to look up. She was certainly not supposed to speak in a language only one man in the kingdom could read. But she had just spoken. With her hand, across 200 feet of marble and bone, to the king himself. And the king had set down his wine. They called her the mute, the disowned, the throwaway of House Vale. Her name was Wren, and what she signed that night kept 3 kingdoms from burning. Stay with me on this one. You will not see this coming. Wren was 8 years old when she stopped speaking. Her mother died on a Tuesday, slow, in a bed that smelled of lavender and rust, and the words she had been saving for her daughter never came out. Wren held her hand until the fingers cooled. Then she walked out of the room and did not say another word for the next 12 years. The doctors called it grief. The priests called it a curse. Her father, Lord Vale, called it embarrassing. He had buried a wife. He could not bury the silence of a child who would not even cry where guests could see her. So he put her in the east wing. He took her food up twice a day. He pretended she was not his. But Wren was not empty. She watched. She read every book in her mother's locked library, including the ones the household servants whispered about. She learned the hand language her mother had taught her on long, sick afternoons, the one her mother had learned from a vampire midwife 2 valleys over. It was the silent tongue used by the old vampire courts when a king did not want his enemies to hear him think. Wren learned every sign. She practiced in the mirror until her wrists ached. She kept the language safe because her mother had asked her to, and her mother's last clear word, the only one Wren still heard inside her head, was promise. She kept the promise. For 12 years. Her father did not know she could speak with her hands. He did not know she could read 4 languages. He did not know she had memorized the Vale family ledger from the year her great-grandfather first sold farmland to the Crimson Council. He did not know that on the night the tribute envoy rode up the gravel drive with a banner of black wings on a red field, his daughter was waiting in the upstairs window in a clean dress, calm, ready. The envoy was simple. House Vale was 3 years behind on tribute. The Crimson Council, which is to say the Vampire King, expected payment. Lord Vale had no gold. He had no land left worth taking. He had 2 daughters. The older one, Cassia, was engaged to a duke in the south, and her father had already spent her bride price on debts. That left Wren, disowned in everything but blood. Easy to give. Easy to forget. The envoy was an older vampire with gray at his temples and a politeness that ran like cold water. He stood in the foyer and named the law as if reading from a tax form. One girl, 18 or older, unmarried, sound of body, given freely to the king's court for 1 year of service. After that year, if she lived, she could be sent home. If she died, the tribute was complete. Lord Vale did not argue. He poured the envoy a drink. He called for Wren. She came down the staircase without looking at him. She wore the gray wool her mother had been buried in. She had taken nothing else from her room. She stood in front of the envoy and held out her wrists and waited. The envoy was a polite man. He did not chain her then. He bowed instead and said her name, the way you say a name when you already know how the story ends. Wren of House Vale. Welcome. Her father did not say goodbye. He turned and walked into his study and closed the door, and the closing of that door was the last word he ever spoke to her. Wren did not cry. She did not look back. She climbed into the black carriage. The horses were not horses exactly. They breathed cold mist. The wheels did not creak. The envoy sat across from her and folded his hands and said nothing for the entire 8-hour ride, and Wren, for the first time in 12 years, was almost grateful for someone who was willing to be quiet with her. They reached the obsidian cathedral at moonrise. Wren had heard of the place all her life. Every child in the kingdom had. It was the seat of the Vampire King, built into the cliff above the Black Lake, a cathedral that doubled as a throne room because the king did not believe in separating worship from rule. The walls were polished stone the color of wet ink. The windows were tall and red, and let in nothing but the light of the moon strained through old glass. The floor was a single slab of marble veined with something that, in certain lights, looked like dried blood and in other lights, looked like the map of a country no one alive could name. Wren walked across that floor in bare feet because tribute girls walked barefoot. She did not flinch when the marble was cold. She did not flinch when she saw the court. She had been preparing for the court her entire life, and she had decided, somewhere on the gravel road outside her father's house, that nothing in this room was going to be allowed to scare her in a way the room could see. There were perhaps 300 vampires in attendance. Old families, council members, dukes, generals, the king's confessor, the king's blade master, 3 ambassadors from the Western covens, and a single old woman in gray, sitting in a low chair near the dais, who Wren guessed must be the midwife or the kingdom's last living memory keeper. Every face turned when she entered. Every face was beautiful in the way old stone is beautiful, smooth and cold and patient. The Crimson Council sat in a semicircle of high-backed chairs to the right of the throne. 12 of them. The one closest to the king was a tall, lean vampire with silver rings on every finger, and a face that smiled even when it was thinking about killing you. That was Duke Calder. Wren had read about him in her mother's books. He was the king's oldest advisor. He was also, if her mother's notes were correct, the king's oldest enemy. The Vampire King himself sat on the throne at the far end of the hall. He did not look 200 years old. He looked 32 and tired, the way a man looks after a long campaign he never asked to lead. His hair was black. His coat was black. His eyes were the color of old amber. He did not look at Wren as she crossed the floor. He looked at the goblet in his hand. He looked at the council. He looked at the candles. He looked everywhere except at the tribute girl, because he had seen too many tribute girls and he had stopped letting himself see them. Wren reached the dais. She climbed the 3 steps. She turned to face the court. She lowered her eyes the way she had been told tribute girls were supposed to lower them. And then she lifted them again. That was the first thing she did that was not in the script. The court did not gasp. The court was too old to gasp. But the silence changed shape. Duke Calder, 3 chairs from the king, tilted his head a half-inch. The old woman in gray leaned forward in her chair. The king set his goblet down on the arm of his throne and finally looked at her. His eyes were not cruel. That was the second thing Wren learned that night. The first was that her mother's books had been telling the truth. The third thing she learned was that someone in this room was about to kill him. She had seen it on the way in. The goblet on the small ebony table beside the throne, the one a page had carried out just before she entered, the one with the faint film of green at the rim that a human eye would not have noticed, but a girl who had spent 12 years staring at the world without speaking had trained herself to see. The film of green was wolfsbane oil distilled. Her mother's books were specific about this. Wolfsbane oil did not hurt humans. It did not hurt most vampires. It hurt one kind of vampire only, the line of the old kings, the bloodline that ran in the throat of the man on the throne. 1 sip and his heart would stop in 3 minutes. 2 sips and his heart would stop in 1. The page had not poured the goblet. The page had been carrying it from somewhere else. Wren had watched where the page came from. Wren had watched which council member's hand had brushed the rim. It had been Calder's hand. She did not have time to be afraid. She did not have time to plan. She had time only to keep her promise. So she raised her hand. 2 fingers extended, the third bent, thumb tucked, the wrist turned a quarter to the left. It was the old court sign for poison. Then she touched her own throat with the same 2 fingers. The old court sign for the king. Then she pointed slowly at the goblet on the ebony table. The king's amber eyes moved from her hand, to the goblet, to Duke Calder and back to her hand. He did not move. He did not speak. But his face, the face he had been wearing for 200 years, changed by a degree so small that no one in the room except Wren and the old woman in gray saw it change. He set the goblet down without drinking. He stood. He raised one hand and said, in a voice that was very quiet and very even, "We will pause the ceremony." The court did not pause ceremonies. The court had not paused a tribute ceremony in 80 years. Calder stood up too. Smiling. Always smiling. He said, "Your Majesty, the girl is mute. The girl is also disowned. Whatever she is doing with her hands is the desperate noise of a stray child trying to delay her duty. Surely we will not interrupt the law for a stray." The king did not look at him. The king looked at Wren. He said, "What is your name?" She could not answer with her voice. So she signed it. W. R. N. The vowel for breath. The court did not understand. Calder did not understand. But the king, who had once been a young prince in a court where his own mother had taught him the silent tongue, the king understood. He said her name out loud. Wren. Then he said, "Wren of House Vale, you will come with me." The Crimson Council erupted. Not in shouting, because vampires of that age do not shout, but in a wave of low murmurs that filled the cathedral like water rising in a cellar. Calder stepped between the king and the dais. He said the law. He said tradition. He said that a tribute girl who broke the silence forfeited her life on the floor where she stood, and any king who took her from the dais broke the same law his ancestors had written in their own blood. The king listened. The king did not move. The king said, "The law also says that a king who drinks poison breaks no law because he is dead. The girl saved my life. The girl will come with me. Anyone who wishes to argue may argue with the Blade Master." The Blade Master, a vampire the size of a winter door, stepped forward from the shadow behind the throne. No one argued. Wren walked off the dais. She did not look at Calder. She did not look at the council. She looked only at the king's hand, which he held out to her without quite touching her, the way you hold a hand out to a horse you do not yet know. She put her own hand in his. His skin was cool. Not cold. Cool like the underside of a river stone. He led her through a small door behind the throne, and the door closed behind them, and the cathedral that had been silent for the last 4 minutes finally allowed itself to breathe. He took her to a small library. He did not sit. He did not let go of her hand until she gently took it back. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched his face try to remember how to look at a person who was not a problem to be solved. Then he said, "Tell me everything, please. Use your hands. I will be patient." She did. She told him about Calder's brush of the rim. She told him about the page who carried the goblet. She told him about the wolfsbane oil. She told him about her mother. She told him about the books in the locked library. She told him about the promise. The king listened without interrupting. The king, who had not asked anyone a question in 83 years, asked her 3. And then, because the rest of the world was still happening on the other side of that small door, he sent her home. He did not want to. She did not want to go. But the law required that a tribute girl, once accepted, be returned to her family overnight before her year of service began, so that no one could say the king had stolen her. The king sent her back to her father's house in his own carriage, with 2 of his own guards, with a sealed letter that said she was under royal protection until sunset the following day. Wren rode home in the dark. She did not sleep. She watched the road behind her in case Calder had sent someone, but no one came, and the carriage rolled up the gravel drive an hour before dawn. Lord Vale opened the door himself. He had not slept either. He looked at the carriage. He looked at the seal. He looked at his daughter. He said, "You are still alive." She nodded. He stepped back. He let her in. He did not ask her what had happened. He went into his study and closed the door, and Wren, for the first time in 12 years, did not feel anything when he closed it. She walked into the kitchen. She lit the small fire under the kettle. She washed the blood off her bare feet, because the marble in the cathedral had cut her in 2 places. She scrubbed the floor where she had dripped. She sat at the table. She drank a cup of plain hot water with a slice of lemon her mother used to slice the same way. She breathed. She thought, for the first time in a very long time, that she might be allowed to live. A knock at the door. The kettle was still warm in her hand when the front door opened without waiting for anyone to answer it. 2 royal guards stepped into the foyer. Their uniforms were red and black. Their faces were familiar. They had ridden in the carriage with her. They bowed to her. They said, "Lady Wren, the king has summoned you back. We are to escort you immediately." Wren stood up. She looked at the letter in the older guard's hand. Royal seal. Royal handwriting. Identical to the letter she had been sent home with. She nodded. She set down the kettle. She walked toward the door. And then she stopped. She stopped because the older guard, the one who had been silent the whole ride home, the one she had trusted, was wearing a silver ring on his smallest finger. She had seen that ring before. She had seen it 3 hours ago, on the hand of Duke Calder, brushing the rim of a goblet on a small ebony table. Calder did not wear his rings. Calder gave them to people. The letter in the guard's hand was a forgery. The summons was poisoned. And the moment she stepped into that carriage, she would not be going to the king. She would be going into a forest where no one would find her body until the spring thaw. And the king, when he received the news that his rescued tribute girl had vanished on the way back to court, would believe that she had run, and the court would believe Calder when he said, "I told you." Astray. Wren did not run. Wren did not scream. Wren did not have a voice with which to scream, but more importantly, she did not have any interest in screaming. She had been preparing for this kind of moment her entire life. She turned around. She walked back into the kitchen. She picked up the kettle of hot water. She walked to the foyer. She smiled very softly, the way a girl smiles when she has decided. And then she threw the boiling water into the older guard's face. He went down screaming. The younger guard drew his sword. Wren ducked under it. She had learned from her mother's books that vampires of the royal household guard were trained to fight tall opponents. She was not tall. She slid under the second guard's blade, came up behind him, and drove her elbow into the small notch at the base of his skull, the one her mother's anatomy book had circled in red ink. He dropped. She took his sword. She did not know how to use a sword. She did not have to. She had to live for 10 more minutes. She ran into her father's study. He was at his desk. He looked up. He said her name, the first word he had said to her in 12 years. He said Wren. She did not answer. She did not have time. She wrote on the back of his ledger in her mother's silent shorthand 3 lines. Calder is poisoning the king. The summons is a forgery. Send for the king's real guard. She thrust the ledger into her father's hands. She held his eyes. She waited. For the first time in 12 years, her father did the right thing. He grabbed his horn and blew the house alarm, the one that called every household guard in the valley, and within minutes the gravel drive was full of horses. He sent his fastest rider to the cathedral with a sealed message in his own hand. The rider did not stop. The rider did not stop for 14 miles. The rider reached the cathedral at noon. The king came himself. He came with 30 of his own guards. He came with the blade master. He came with the old woman in gray, who Wren now learned was named Eilis, the king's mother, who had not left her chambers in 60 years and who insisted, when she heard what had happened, on coming personally to thank the girl who had spoken the silent tongue at her son. The king walked into Lord Vale's foyer. He stepped over the 2 unconscious guards still lying on the floorboards. He looked at Wren. He said, "You are still alive." She nodded. He almost smiled. He said, "You and I have a court to settle. And here is where it turns." If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want the rest of these. And believe me, the next 10 minutes are the ones you came for. They rode back to the cathedral in the same carriage Wren had ridden out of it in. She sat across from the king. She did not speak. She did not need to. He read her hands the way another man might read a newspaper. He told her on the ride who Calder really was. Calder had been the king's father's friend. Calder had been the one who had whispered into the old king's ear, the night the old king died of an illness no one could name, that perhaps the young prince was not ready to take the throne. The old king had died anyway. The young prince had taken the throne anyway. Calder had spent the next 200 years smiling, advising, brushing the rims of goblets that other people drank from. Wren was not the first warning the king had ever received about Calder. She was only the first warning he could not dismiss, because she had no reason to lie, no ambition to feed, no voice to use against him later. She had only her hands and her mother's promise. They reached the cathedral at dusk. The court was already assembled. Calder had called an emergency session, claiming that the king had been bewitched by a mute peasant and was no longer fit to rule. Calder was standing at the foot of the throne when the king walked in. Calder was still smiling. The king walked past him without speaking. The king climbed the 3 steps of the dais, the same dais Wren had stood on the night before, and he sat down on his own throne, and he gestured with one hand for Wren to come and stand beside him. She did. 300 vampires watched her climb the steps. 300 vampires watched a tribute girl, a human, a disowned daughter of a minor house, stand at the right hand of the vampire king in the place where, by law, only the king's chosen witness was permitted to stand. The king spoke. He said, "This girl saved my life last night. I am going to allow her to tell you how. She will use her hands. My mother will translate for those of you who have forgotten the silent tongue. Anyone who interrupts will answer to the blade master. Begin." Wren began. She lifted her hands. She told them about the goblet. She told them about the green film at the rim. She told them about the wolfsbane oil and which line of vampires it killed. She told them about the page boy and which corridor he had come from. She told them, slowly, deliberately, sign by sign, about Calder's silver ring on the hand of the forged guard who had come to her father's house at dawn. She named the silversmith in the lower city who had made the ring. She named the herbalist 3 valleys away, who sold wolfsbane oil only to one buyer. She named the buyer. She had memorized the buyer's name from one of her mother's books, because her mother had written, in the margin, "This is the man who will one day try to kill a king." The court did not breathe. Eilis translated in a voice as soft as falling ash. Calder stopped smiling for the first time in 200 years. When Wren finished, the king stood up. He said, "Duke Calder, speak." Calder spoke. Calder was good at speaking. Calder had spoken his way out of 3 centuries of trouble. But Calder was speaking now against a witness who had no voice, which meant he was speaking against silence, and silence, when it is told correctly, cannot be argued with. Every name Wren had given was checked, that night, by the king's own people. Every name was real. The silversmith was found. The herbalist was found. The page boy was found. The forgery was found in the ashes of the kitchen fireplace, where the forged guard had tried to burn it. By midnight, Calder had nothing left to say. He stood in the center of the cathedral floor, and he looked, for the first time, like the old man he actually was. The king did not execute him. The king was not that kind of king. The king stripped him of his title, his rings, his lands, his name, and exiled him to the cold coast where the sun lived 9 months of the year and no vampire of any age could survive it without a great deal of help. Calder walked out of the cathedral in plain wool. He did not look back. He died, the records say, 6 weeks later of nothing in particular. The king turned to Wren. The court was still watching. 300 vampires, the Crimson Council, the king's mother, the Blade Master, the ambassadors from the Western Covens. The king did something no king of his line had done in 200 years. He stepped down from his throne. He walked to the center of the marble floor. And he knelt, on one knee, in front of a mute, disowned human girl in a borrowed gray dress. He said, "Wren of House Vale, I have no language for what I owe you. But I am asking you, in front of this court, to stay. Not as tribute, not as service, as the only person in this kingdom whose silence I am willing to listen to. Stay." She did not have to think. She signed yes. The court did not erupt. The court did the thing that vampire courts almost never do. It applauded. Quietly at first, and then in waves, the old family standing, the Crimson Council standing, the ambassadors standing, Eiley standing, the Blade Master, last and slowest, also standing. Wren stood on the marble floor with the king on one knee in front of her, and she understood very clearly that her mother's promise had been kept. In the morning, she went back to her father's house one more time. She did not have to. The king offered to send anyone. She wanted to do it herself. She rode in a black carriage that was not chained to anyone. She arrived at noon. Her father was waiting in the foyer. He looked older. He looked smaller. He did not know what to do with his hands. He said her name. He said it twice. She walked past him into the east wing, into her old room, and she packed her mother's books, all of them, into 2 wooden trunks. She left the gray wool dress on the bed. She did not need it. She had been given new clothes by the king's mother, simple ones, not court finery, the kind of clothes a witness wears. On her way out, she stopped in front of her father. She did not sign. She did not speak. She looked at him for a long moment, the way her mother had looked at him on the last clear afternoon of her life. Then she lifted one hand. She made the silent tongue sign for peace. It was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was a different sign. It was peace, which is the sign you make when you have decided to walk out of a house and not come back, and you do not need the house to be sorry, and you do not need the house to understand. He did not know the sign. He understood it anyway. He stepped back. He let her pass. She did not look back at the gravel drive. She did not look back at the upstairs window. She rode to the obsidian cathedral in the light of a clean morning, and she walked through the front doors as a witness this time, not a tribute, and the doors did not close behind her the way they had closed the first time. They opened. They kept opening for the rest of her long, useful, quiet life. The king did not ask her to love him. He did not court her. He did not give her jewels. He gave her a small library next to his own, with a door that connected the 2 rooms, and a chair by the window where she could read in the strained red light of the old glass. He brought her tea in the evenings. He sat across from her. He asked her sometimes what she thought. She told him with her hands. He listened. 200 years of court, and he had finally learned how to listen. People in the kingdom, for the rest of Wren's life, called her many things. The silent witness. The girl who signed across the court. The mute who saved the king. Wren never called herself any of these. When she was old, when her hair was gray, when her hands were slower, she still kept her mother's promise. She still did not speak with her voice. She did not need to. The only man in the kingdom whose hearing mattered to her had learned, 200 years late, to read the language his own mother had taught him, and he read it the way a man reads the only letter he has ever waited for. And the goblet on the small ebony table, the one with the green film at the rim, was kept in a glass case in a small room behind the throne, dry, empty, harmless, for as long as Wren lived. A reminder, not of the poison, of the silence that had spoken in time, of the girl who had been thrown away by one house and accepted by a kingdom, of a promise made by a dying mother on a slow Tuesday and kept in the end by 2 raised fingers across 200 feet of marble and bone, in a room full of people who had forgotten how to listen to the one person they could not afford to ignore.